with you the story of Antietam's Dunker Church. Now, obviously, the Battle of Antietam, fought on September the 17th, 1862, huge event in American history with lots of long-lasting impacts. Huge impacts on the course of the Civil War, impacts on the course of freedom, and it is mostly known for its awful impacts in the most casualties in one day, in one place, in the history of the United States of America. But one side of the story that's often overlooked is the simple fact that in the center of this worst battle our country's ever seen stood a humble church dedicated to the principles of peace and goodwill. You couldn't make up a story like that and have anyone believe you, but it is all true. So this evening, what I'd like to do is share this story, share a little bit of the background of the church and the background of the folks that would have attended there, a little bit about the battle itself and the aftermath of the battle and the role the church played, and we'll look at some of the times since the war in the many ups and downs, sometimes literal ups and downs, the church has been through since the war. Now, when you come to visit Antietam Battlefield, you will certainly see the church. It is right across the street from the visitor center. It's the first stop on the driving tour, so folks certainly see it, but oftentimes don't realize what it is or the significance of it. I mean, it doesn't necessarily look like a church. And of course, there's that name, Dunker. What is that to do with donuts, or what is that all about? Well, to learn a little bit more about the Dunkers, what we do is look at what their actual name would have been. During the Civil War, the official name would have been the German Baptist Brethren. So to learn a little bit more about them, all we have to do is break down that longer name. The first part is obviously German. The religion got started in Germany in the year 1708 in the town of Schwarzenau, Germany. A small group of followers went out into the Ida River and baptized themselves. That's the second part of the name, and obviously that's what these folks would have been most known for. Because at the time, most religions had baptism where they were in a ceremony in the church, of sprinkling infants. And here were grown adults going out into the river and dunking themselves under the water. They started to be known as Tunkers, from the German word tunken, which means to dip in the water. What do you know? In later years, when they come to America, you switch from German to English, you change the T to a D, and you have Dunker. It sounds the same, means the same, and it's just a nickname. It comes from the form of baptism. Now, the third part is Brethren. The Dunkers were part of the Pietism movement. They wanted a much more personal experience in their religion. They viewed themselves as all of God's children, would call each other brethren. And again, they were very similar to other so-called plain people like Amish and Mennonite, and basically wanted a very literal interpretation of the New Testament. They were against most any sort of indulgences, against drinking and gambling and swearing of oaths. They were against slavery, and most of all, they were against violence, which again would make what happened to them a little later in the story all the more ironic. Now, for a while, things went very well there in Schwarzenau. Lots of folks came and joined with them, and the religion started to grow. Problem is, this is all illegal. There were only a few certain state churches at the time. If you were one of them, then you were in good shape. If you remember something else, well, you could face persecution. So throughout the 17 and 1800s, the Dunkers did like many, many other Europeans did, and they emigrated to America for religious freedom. They would have initially come in through the Philadelphia area, settled in the area around there in southeast Pennsylvania, and over the years would have spread out to the west and to the south all across the country. We do know that at least by the 1750s, there are some Dunkers there in mid-Maryland. We know that from a story from the French and Indian War and the Braddock campaign, which went right through Boonesboro and Sharpsburg and the Hagerstown area. And there is an account where they stayed with a local Dunker farmer named Jacob Brombach. General Braddock specifically noted this because at the time he had provided them with supplies and a place to stop and provided medical care for a very young, very sick Colonel George Washington who was along. So at least by 1755, there are some Dunkers there in central Maryland. Initially, they would have just attended services in each other's homes until they got enough folks in an area to make a meeting house. Now, the first one there in central Maryland is called the Manor Church, and that's in the town of Tilmonton, which is just 3 or 4 miles north of Sharpsburg. Manor Church is still in operation there in Tilmonton. Eventually, there got to be enough folks there in Sharpsburg that by about 1850, they started to plan for their own meeting house. And a couple of local members named Samuel and Elizabeth Mumma donated some of their land up along the main road, the Sharpsburg Pike, Hagerstown Pike, for the purpose of building a meeting house. And they came together as a congregation, did all the work themselves. By 1853, the church was built and ready to be put into use. Now, again, the church is very, very plain. You'll notice there's no steeple on top of the building. There's no stained glass windows. There's no, not even a sign outside saying what it is. If we had come to the church for a service on a Sunday, first thing is the gentleman would have went in the eastern door, which is the door facing the road that you normally see in pictures, and sat on the right-hand side of the room. The ladies would have entered on the southern end of the building and sat on the left-hand side. The inside of the church is just as plain as the outside is. If you go inside, there are just simply wooden benches the folks would have sat on, a large wooden table at the front, which there would have been a Bible, which they read scripture out of, and that's about it. There's a wood stove in the center for heat in the wintertime, but you'll notice not many of the other things you would expect in churches. Again, no decorations. There's no musical instruments. They would have just sung a cappella, and not really much of anything in there. And again, whether it be in the building, in their dress, or all that, Dunkers wanted all the attention focused to be on the Lord, not on them. We don't have any pictures of a service at the time of the Civil War, but the local Church of the Brethren, which is what the church would eventually evolve to become there in our area, does a commemorative service every year. And during the early years of the commemorative service, folks would dress in period attire. And here's one from, I believe, 1970, picture of them having the service. So you can get an idea of what it would have been like. They would have had, again, a cappella singing, reading of scripture, and sometimes they would have multiple speakers. They wouldn't have, at least at first, fully trained elected pastors. They would elect deacons and elders, and the elders would do the speaking. They would sometimes, though, have circuit pastors that would travel from church to church. Now, for some time, the Dunkers had a pretty nice, peaceful existence there along the Antietam Creek. They had a very productive farms, and things were going very well for them. But that's not what was going on in the larger picture of our country. And whether they agreed with things like violence and war or not, those things would end up coming to them. Now, on September the 14th, 1862, was a Sunday. Dunkers were having service in their church. And as they wrapped things up for the day, several of the folks went down over the hill to the Mumma farm for some lunch. And they noticed the children came running in saying that there was some sort of commotion to the east. And as they looked off towards the ridge, they could see smoke and sometimes explosions and hear loud noise. And what they were hearing from is action from what's known as the Battle of South Mountain. Now, in the much larger picture of the Civil War, the Confederate Army, riding a string of victories throughout the summer, has decided to try to strike while the iron's hot, capitalize on their momentum, and take the fight up into Northern Territory. From Virginia, they start north up through Maryland. Union Army gives chase, and their first contact is actually up on the rugged terrain up on top of South Mountain. As the day wears on, more and more soldiers start to stream down off the ridge, down into the valley, down to the towns of Boonesboro and Keedysville and Sharpsburg. And I'm sure the local folks, including the Dunkers, were, pretty apprehensive, wondering what was going on. Luckily, it did take a couple days for things to get set up into an actual battle, so they did have some time to get things together. The soldiers did go door to door, tell the local folks, might be something happening here, might be best if you were not here. And surprisingly, the folks did actually listen, and most left. So the Dunkers, most of the folks that lived out on the fields anyway, were not there during the battle, so they weren't in any physical danger of harm themselves. But when they would come back, what they would find is a much, much different situation than what they had left behind. Their lives would be forever changed from that day forward. Now, we don't have time this evening, nor is it my aim to get into a real technical analysis of the battle. I'm not the fellow for that anyway, but I just want to point out a few important things in the roles that the church played in the battle itself. The church is the classic example of wrong place at the wrong time. Confederate Army is there first, and they're going to be outnumbered, so they're going to want to capitalize and give themselves the best possible defensive position by using the terrain. Luckily for them, there is some high ground. The ridge runs north from Sharpsburg. Also, right along that ridge runs the main road. So not only would give them the high ground, it would give them some mobility to move things back and forth. It just so happens that where this advantageous position is, right there is where the church sits. So all through the morning of battle, the Union Army makes wave after wave of attack. As you can see in this classic Hope painting, the Union Army is coming all across the waves of field at the Confederate artillery position, and all these waves are coming right at the Dunkirk church. In the fog and smoke and noise and chaos of the morning's action, I'm sure it was very easy for the Union commanders to say, see that bright white building? It's the only building in the whole area. It's bright white against those dark woods. That's where they are. Go that way. Wave after wave went through there. Union Army at times even made it up to the church, pushed into the west woods behind it, took terrible losses, and eventually pulled out. Eventually, the action would shift down to the middle of the field to the sunken road, down to the lower end of the field to the Burnside Bridge, without a huge amount of gain for either side there on that northern end of the field. But just in the first 3 hours of the day, there were over 12,000 casualties combined on both sides. If you do the math, that is 1 per second. Early historian Ezra Carman said that the area from the church going north was the most blood-soaked square mile in the U.S. military history. Now, you would see, sorry for I'm behind on my pictures there, so the action coming right up above this is a famous one they put on a postage stamp not too long ago. But if you're going to have this awful battle, and again, I wasn't using hyperbole at the beginning of the talk. I said the church was in the middle of the worst battle ever. It's not only in the middle of the worst battle ever, it's in the middle of the worst part of the worst battle ever. And if you're going to have that kind of destruction, that kind of action, then you're obviously going to have awful, awful results. This Alexander Gardner photo is probably one of the most famous photos in U.S. military history, looking right over from where the visitor center is now towards the church. Goes without saying the damage and the cost this battle took on those that participated in it, and you can see them all across the field in this picture. You can also see an awful lot of damage to the church itself. Big holes blown in the side of the walls, in the roof. This is an awful, awful scene all around. I want to read you a quick account from some Ohio soldiers that wrote later in a letter home that as they came up to the scene around the church, they wrote, "A little crowd of soldiers were standing around the church, and within, a few severely wounded rebels were stretched out on the benches, one of whom was raving in his agony. Surgical aid and proper attendance had already been furnished. We did not join the throng of curious visitors within. Out in the grove behind us, out behind the little church, the dead had already been collected in groups ready for burial. No matter in what direction we turned, it was all the same shocking picture, awakening awe rather than pity, benumbing the senses rather than touching the heart, and glazing the eye with horror rather than filling it with tears." The day after, a man named Alfred Woad, newspaper sketch artist, made his famous sketch of almost like a de facto truce out in front of the church as the men came together to care for the wounded and maybe even trade things. And, it was amazing just hours after this horrific battle that they could, act this way and be so cordial. And, so many early accounts would say, well, the church was a hospital. Well, sure, it was. But it wasn't quite the same as what we would consider a hospital today. It'd be much more a triage, or basically the emergency room. It didn't have the things needed for a hospital. It wasn't very big. It didn't have a water supply. It didn't have food supply. What it did have, though, was lots and lots of patients. And there certainly are accounts of immediate operations and amputations taking place in the church. They said at one point what they would do is do the amputations and throw the limb out the window. At one point, the pile of limbs got so high, it had fallen back in the window, so they had to get the farmers to bring their wagons to haul away the limbs. Again, awfulness. They also were right along the road, so they could gather up the wounded men, take them in wagons off to the other area farm hospitals and get them set up there. So this would have just been immediate after the medical attention there. But the church would continue to be a hub of activity. Again, it's about the only main landmark for miles and miles along that road there. So there would still be meetings like in this picture. It would continue to be lots of activity for some time. It's claimed that Abraham Lincoln visited there when he came and toured after about a month later. But the end result of all of this is when the armies moved on, there were still lots and lots left behind, and the care is just getting started, and the impact on these local folks is just getting started. Again, we don't have time to get into much of that. That's a whole nother subject for a presentation, is the huge impact that this had on these local folks. When they come back, well, what they had left behind is much, much different. As you know, it was right in the middle of harvest season. All they'd worked for all year, really put everything into, well, now that's either destroyed in battle or eaten by hungry soldiers, or, you know, most of that's gone. Their fields are destroyed and trampled. You know, some of their houses and properties really damaged. And now, well, they're going to need to provide care for a long, long time to get these men back to health that did all of this on their property. The worst example of this damage was to the Mumma farm. The folks that donated the land for the church, their farm was completely destroyed in the middle of the battle. So again, this is going to, for one day battle, this is going to last a long, long time until they can get back to any semblance of normalcy. You know, we talk about trying to get back to normal here from the virus. Think about the impact it's going to take to get back to normal there after this battle there at Sharpsburg. Now, eventually, they did work their way to try to get back to normal, but there was some controversy of whether they should repair the church and put it back into service. Some folks said that, you know, it had been desecrated from, you know, the very things that they're against is what happened in there. Eventually, though, they did decide, no, they would put it back into service. They would patch it up, clean it up, and it took till the spring of 1864 until finally the church was put back into service. But one thing would never be the same, and that is, well, one of the biggest events in American history took place on your property. So from that day forward, there were lots and lots of tourists. Here's some awful fancy tourists there wanting to get their picture taken. And if you're going to come to a historic place, you're going to want to get your picture taken. So again, you've got the Burnside Bridge to stand on, or you can go stand in front of the church. One picture that I found in the archive that entertained me, I thought this kind of looked like maybe a 1970s folk album cover. You know, on this one, here's some fellas posing, they're social distancing, and everything there in front of the church. As the years went by, tourists became veterans coming back for reunions. Here's the 125th PA Regiment from where I live. They came down and had one of their big reunions there. And of course, if you're going to come, you want to get your picture taken there in front of the church. Lots and lots of reunions would use the church imagery on their ribbons and things like that. And even, you know, folks did remember it and make accounts of it. When Ezra Carmen sent out letters asking for information of where men were on the field and things that they do, some sent back maps. And here, see, this is a New Jersey soldier told about where his artillery was, and there's the church in the middle. They remembered that. You know, again, they may not have remembered exactly where they were and what was going on, this and that, but, you know, the church was really the only building there and really something that they could remember and use as a reference point. O.T. Reilly, one of the famous early tour guides, tells a story about he brought some men from the Stonewall Brigade on a tour, and they asked to stop out in front of the church, and they got out and gathered around it and prayed. He said he'd never seen anything like that. You will see An awful lot of monuments are there around the church. There's not very many monuments on the Antietam battlefield. Main reason is the government didn't own the land like they did at Gettysburg and some of the other battlefields. So it was really quite a complicated, expensive process to get those done. So if you're going to go to the trouble to do that, you want to make sure you put them somewhere that people are going to see them. So a lot of them are by the church because, again, if you're going to go to visit the field, you're going to want to go and see the church. And if you go see the church, well, maybe you'll see our monument too. It is about this time in the memorial time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that we come to the story of the Dunkard Church Bible. Now, I mentioned during a service, there was a large Bible that sat on the table there in the front of the sanctuary. In the days after the battle, folks already knew this was a really big event, because what do folks do when they know there's a really big event? Well, they want to get a souvenir. And one soldier, he must have known this was, and he must have wanted a souvenir really badly, because the church Bible was gigantic. If you've ever seen it, it is in the museum there at the visitor center, the battlefield now, very big and very heavy. But a young man named Sergeant Nathan Dykeman, he put it in his pack and went along his way. At some point, we're not sure when, he must have had some leave time. He went back to his home in Elmira, New York, and left it there. He went back and fought all the way through the war. He made it all the way through the Appomattox, and he and his brother were there at the Grand Review Parade at the end of the war. Does not mean, though, that he made it back home. As they left Washington, he didn't want to wait on the trains that were going to take the rest of his regiment soldiers home. It was going to be a few days, so he decided he would walk. So he and his brother started walking north, and they thought, well, we'll know how to find our way home. We'll just follow the railroad tracks. They're headed north. We got to get to a town we know, and we'll keep going. Well, outside Washington, there are lots and lots of tracks coming together. And as they were walking north, there were several tracks side by side. And as they were walking, they knew a train was coming towards them on the track they were walking. So he and his brother knew they would have to get out of the way. His brother, who was to his left, stepped off the track into the grass. But Nathan stepped to the right onto the next track. And somehow, in all the commotion and noise and smoke, he didn't realize there was a train coming behind him. When he stepped over onto that track, he was struck by the train and immediately killed. He fought all the way through the Civil War, but never made it back home. Now, that Bible is still in his house. No one knows that it's there. His sister lived in his house the whole rest of her life. And when she got up in age, she'd gotten some financial trouble, decided to sell the house, and she started to go through her brother's things. And in his things, she found this big Bible. And inside the cover, it said it belonged to this Dunkard Church in Sharpsburg, Maryland. She didn't know where that was or what that was, or she didn't have any means or wasn't able to take it back. So she gave it to the local veterans group from the 107th New York to see what they could do with it. They didn't know what to do with it either, till they remembered a recent article in the newspaper, an article about a man named John T. Lewis. Now, Mr. Lewis was an African-American man from eastern Maryland. He was raised a Dunker, and later in life, he moved up there to Elmira, New York. By most accounts, he had a pretty quiet life, was a sharecropping farmer, and he and his wife worked for one of the richest men in the area there, a man named Charles Langdon. Now, one day as he was headed to pick up his wife from work, he noticed coming down the road from that farm, there was a horse and carriage going way, way too fast. The horse was weaving back and forth, and Mr. Lewis knew there was a sharp curve there. If the horse didn't slow down, well, they would tip, and those women and children would go down over a steep bank. They'd be in very severe danger. So thinking quickly, he steered his horse and wagon up as close as he could to a fence made like a V shape. So the horse had to slow down to run into that V. When it did, he jumped over on the horse, got it stopped, and saved those people on the wagon. Now, he was just doing what he thought was right. It turns out it was Mr. Langdon's wife and children. Suddenly now, Mr. Lewis is a big hero. They wrote an article in the newspaper about him. Mr. Langdon gave him some money, which he bought his own farm with. And he also got to be very good friends with Mr. Langdon's wife's brother, Mark Twain. Suddenly, Everybody wants to know Mr. Lewis's name. And the regiment says, hey, I think that guy that saved those people in the horse and wagon, he's a dunker. Let's go ask him. He'll know what to do. So they did. And he arranged for the Bible to be sent back to Sharpsburg. 40 years after it was taken, the Bible was back. And as I mentioned, it is now over in the Visitor Center Museum. They claim Mr. Lewis and Mark Twain were very good friends. They claim that even the character Jim in Huckleberry Finn is based on Mr. Lewis. Not sure about that or not. Now, as things move forward, time was not kind to the Dunker Church. Again, it had a lot of maintenance issues, I would imagine, from the patched up damage from the church. And much more people started to live in the town. The town grew a little bit more, and they said that the folks didn't really want to walk all the way out to the church on the battlefield. So in 1899, Church of the Brethren built a new church down on the main street in town. And for a while, they tried to continue having services out at the little battlefield church. But again, things kind of drug on a little bit. And by 1916, when the last pastor there, a man named John Otto, died, they stopped having services altogether. Now, while you would see things like this, which is a very touristy postcard from the time there, that's not what the area looked like. There in the teens and 20s, this is what the church looked like, the area around the church. I call this picture, "Where's the church?" It's right here. But again, as you can see, the trees are growing up around it. There's all sorts of clutter and houses and fences. The West Woods is completely gone. Here's an aerial photo from the time that'll give you an idea that the area looks nothing like it did during the battle. Church is right here. Here's monuments now, the New York Monument and the Maryland Monument. Those are all here, but you can see there's this farm right up against it. There's a house across the road here. The entire West Woods is completely gone. So this whole area looks very, very different than what it would have at the time. Finally, people really started to get concerned about the church. They said that one newspaper article I read said that people that come to visit started to chip a brick out of the back corner for a souvenir. And there was a hole big enough people could climb in and sleep at night if it was cold out. I saw where people would use some wood out of one of the window frames for a campfire as they went through. So the church kept getting in worse shape and worse shape. And finally, in the spring of 1921, a huge windstorm swept through the area, did lots of damage, destroyed crops, knocked out windows, and the biggest thing it did was flatten the Dunker Church. Suddenly now, the local congregation had a problem on their hands. They weren't using this church anyway. It's going to take a lot to rebuild it. Church became a tourist attraction itself. If you look at this picture of the rubble, there's a lady sitting on top of it up here, getting her picture taken.
Uh-huh.
So again, it's going to take a lot of work. They didn't necessarily want to do that, so they auctioned off the property. By this point, there are 56 heirs to Samuel Mumma, so they had to have an auction, divide the proceeds. And a local man named Elmer Boyer bought the property. He tried to salvage what he could of the materials that are there, which he then stored those materials in his shed down in town. He resold the property to a man named Charles Turner, who built a lunch stand and souvenir counter in a frame building on that same foundation. So if you would have come to the battlefield from the 30s on for a couple decades, there's no church there, but there would be this building. Now, this is the only picture I've ever been able to find of the building, and this is clearly in the wintertime, and things are mostly shut up. When the Park Service took over in 1933, they did a lot of studies of the situation, of the conditions of things on the battlefield, and almost every report complained that this building had all sorts of big signs all around it, drink Coca-Cola and ham and egg sandwiches and ice cold beer and all these things all around. I've never found a picture where those signs were on there. But the point is, the church, is gone. Not what's there if you come to visit the field. For the 75th anniversary, there were big plans. The local historical society was going to try to buy the property back and rebuild the church. They even sent an invitation to President Roosevelt and had a picture of the church on the front of it. They even ran this ad in the newspaper saying, "Famous old church to be restored." They were very certain they were going to be able to get the property back and rebuild the church. Alas, the anniversary came and went, and none of that ever happened. The local folks pretty much accepted that the church was gone. O.T. Reilly put up a monument in the late 20s across the road from the visitor center, basically saying in memory of the Dunkard Church. However, circumstances finally came in as the Historical Society continued to try to buy the property and never were able to get the money together, never able to get the owner to sell. But then opportunity arose out of necessity. In 1951, the Highway Department was deciding to widen the road. The Sharpsburg Pike, Hagerstown Pike, is the main road, between Sharpsburg and Hagerstown, and it's just a very narrow little road. So they were going to almost double the size of it. And the initial plan talked about just widening the road where it is there, and it would have come right up to the historic foundation. Finally, they got the money together. The Historical Society bought the property back. They only really bought 3/10 of an acre, but at least this was protected. Eventually, the Highway Department built a bypass out around through the West Woods, and the road didn't end up doing that anyway. But the end result is they have the church property back, and they gave it back presented it to the Park Service the next Memorial Day with the hopes that the church would get rebuilt. However, the director of the Park Service at the time estimated this would surely cost at least $50,000. They didn't have that money, and the Korean War had just gotten started. So there was just no way they could do anything. No church is being rebuilt. So all they did is they tore the old building off of the foundation and put up a sign that said, "Here's where the church used to be." So if you came all through the 50s, came to see the Dunkard Church, there was just that bare foundation and a sign. Folks still kept, trying. The Park Service historians kept writing reports, kept writing recommendations. Folks started writing letters to the editor of all sorts of different papers, tried to pressure their congressmen and things like that. And the local Church of the Brethren even held a peace pageant out on that foundation and held services outdoor with a big choir and releasing of doves and just anything they could do to try to get attention. But it just didn't seem like anything was going to work. It didn't seem like the church was ever going to get rebuilt. It seemed like it was going to take something monumental to ever get it done. Luckily, such a thing was on the way. It was called the centennial of the Civil War. And luckily for us, the governor of Maryland at the time, a man named Millard Tawes, was a big Civil War buff. He wanted to have all sorts of big Civil War events in his state too. He found out about this church situation and in 1961 allocated $35,000 of the state budget for this church to be rebuilt. He put the Park Service in charge of actually doing it. Again, there weren't blueprints or anything from the original one, so they had to do historic studies, try to figure out what it would look like, how to actually do that, and they put it out for bids. And what do you know? Mr. Boyer still has the stuff in his shed that he salvaged from when the church was blown down. So they went and bought all the parts back from him. So while the church is certainly not the original church, it was missing for 40 years, it was rebuilt with as much as possible original materials. Well, they got started in the fall of 1961, and I just have a few pictures here we'll go through as we can see getting started with the building there. It's starting to look a little bit like something now, starting to get a roof on it now. And in this picture, you can really see where they used a lot of the original material. You can see a difference in the bricks here along the front, where those were the original bricks. There was a lot of the original materials, so many window frames, door frames, the stove that's in there is original, a lot of the floorboards, and I think eventually about 4,000 original bricks. So again, it's as close as possible could be to the original. Almost done here in the late spring of '62. There's got a new paint job, and finally they started to let folks in and see it all through that summer, but the official rededication was set for September the 2nd, 1962. The governor came and spoke. Here he is. He's the second one in here from the left. And as you'll see, there's a big umbrella there. It did pour rain on that day. But one thing I think is kind of neat, there were events that entire month in Washington County. This was not only the 100th anniversary of the battle, it was the, I believe, 200th anniversary of the county there. So there was events every day. There would be like Williamsport Day and Boonesboro Day, and then obviously lots of things there around for the battle itself. For that whole month of September, it rained 2 days. We know one day was the 2nd for this dedication. Do you want to take a guess what the other day it rained in September that year? It was the 17th. And lots of things were washed out there on the actual day of the battle centennial. They had coins made up with the church on. Again, and it just seemed to be, everyone was excited that finally the church was back in its original place. Now, that does not mean that all the work is done. Remember, the Historical Society was only able to buy 3/10 of an acre. So the rest of the area still didn't look much like it would have at the time. Again, the West Woods is completely gone. There is that farm and houses and clutter all around there in that area. This nice bright orange trailer right up against the side of the church. So there was going to be a lot of work still to be done. But thankfully, over the years, the Park Service has been able to obtain most all the land. Different preservation groups have bought land and donated it to the government. In the 80s, they started a replanting program in the West Woods. And finally, by today, things look very, very much the same in the area around the church and in much of the battlefield, for that matter, what it would have looked like at the time of the battle. Now, there's lots of different uses for the church. There's public uses. Most weekends through the summer, there's some kind of charity walk and things. A lot of times they use the church, again, as a reference point for start finish. This is a picture from the 90s. There was a national bike race called the Tour du Pont that actually used the church as a checkpoint. There sometimes are weddings and things like that in there. The Park Service uses it for all sorts of different programs, or things on music and on medicine and things like that. The local Church of the Brethren continues their yearly commemorative service on the Sunday closest to the battle. And certainly the church was well represented when we had the 150th anniversary not long ago. There's trading cards, and there was another coin minted, and all sorts of things like that. And obviously the big yearly events like the Illumination will include the church as well. But I think in the end, the real value of having the church back in its place and having the church there on the battlefield is many things. Number one, it highlights the other side of the story, and that is the impact on the local folks there. So that's a good thing. But I think ultimately the simple fact that when you have such immense, huge, tragic loss like we had at the Battle of Antietam, it almost has to take on a spiritual aspect to it. And the fact that we have this church right there in the middle, that you can go in, you can hear the voices echo, you can just sit there and look out the window and just see trees and almost get yourself in a state of mind to understand what happened there and what that meant for our country. I will leave you today with the words Maryland Governor Millard Tawes left his audience with at that dedication, 1962. He said, "On a field shrouded with smoke, the church alone was the only visible landmark. And so this Dunker church stood out as a beacon by which commanders took their direction and men found their way through the smoky chaos of battle. May it stand in peace as it did in war, as a beacon to guide those searching their way through the darkness. May it stand throughout all ages as a symbol of mercy, peace, and understanding." I thank you folks for your attention. As Chris mentioned, we do have a book. I'm just thrilled that such a thing exists. When I was a park ranger for a long time, and when I got sick and had to retire, I had done talks like this many, many times, and many times just as part of my job every day at the park. And I was just afraid the story would get lost, and I just intended to write the story down for future park rangers to be able to give it. And just by chance, a man named Terry Barkley was the archivist for the Church of the Brethren, helped me a lot. And just on a whim, we decided to send it to a publisher, and they accepted it. And it's just been a wonderful thing that I could get the story out there. And I've just been blessed to all the different folks that I've been able to talk to over the years. So if you would be interested in the book, I did get an email today from my publisher, Savis Beatty, that if you go to their website and order it, you can get 20% off by just using the code virtual, since things are a little different now that, we have to do things like this rather than be in person, and I could sign them and things like that. So, but in any case, I thank you so much for allowing me to share your time here this evening, and I'll see if I can turn things back over to Chris here.
All right.
There we are.
Good. Does anybody have any questions out there? I don't see any in the chat. Give everybody a second. Anybody have anything?
Alan?
Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Alan.
Hi, Elizabeth.
This is the third time I heard this story, and it touches me deeply every time.
It's probably a little
really
different
does.
this time, huh?
But what I wanted to ask you, some of the brethren had slaves, right? And the pipers, do you know if they attended their slaves with them? Do you know that by any?
I don't know about the pipers for sure. I know that just on the specific situations that we know about, like the Mummas did have a couple. Now, we don't know what their motivation was. If they bought them for the intent of releasing them, and they certainly did manumit them very early. We do know that Nancy Camel, she attended up at the Manor Church and is buried up there.
Okay.
So technically, it was definitely frowned slaves. Now, it's just like the rules in every church. Some folks still do things that maybe they shouldn't. But I would say they probably would have encouraged folks to, to manumit and certainly bring them along. But I don't know that if just someone had, if they just had slaves and then bring them as their slave, that probably would be frowned upon. And I would certainly doubt that would be.
Because I know they did it at the Episcopal Church right off the going to Hagerstown. So anyway, and the other question I have, do you know if the brethren, the Tolson Chapel was built in 1866, and quite a few of the former slaves went to the church, also from the Piper Fund. I can't think of his name now. Do you know if any of the brethren ever went over there? Do we know any other connection except the former slaves going there, or did the brethren connect with them, with the Tolson Chapel ministry, once it was established in 1967?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
No, I don't really know of any other connection with them in the Dunkers, other than just, in general, the Dunkers would have been at the forefront, in the abolition movement.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. It's good to see you, good to hear you.
It's nice to hear you, Elizabeth. Thanks so much.
All right. Who else do we have? Stacy, do you have a question? No? How about Mac Bryan? You got a question?
Chris, this is Kevin Clark. Alan, I just sent you a message privately. In the early part of your presentation, you showed a slide of a annual commemoration done by the Brethren Church inside. Did you find that photograph in the archives out at the battlefield, or where did you get it? Because my wife's grandfather is sitting on the bench of pastors.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I got that at the park archive there, or I could certainly email you a copy too. I have it digitally scanned, but yeah, I got that from the park archives.
Okay, I'll just go out to the park archives. Thank you.
Sure.
So we had a question here from Mac Bryan. Do you know the number that was in the congregation of the church at the time of the battle? How big congregation?
No, I really don't. I think there's I had always heard it was about 7 or 8 families. Now, that could be quite a few, and in some of the, the Mummas, I think, had 13 children, so obviously the size of the building there, you wouldn't be able to fit a huge amount in, but quite a few. But if I just had to guess, I would say in the, 60 range, and, that would be my guess. But, I'm sure that varied. From time to time, the church would be part of a circuit with 4 other churches there, with the Manor Church and one in Downsville and one at Marsh Church, they call it. And sometimes they would go once a month to the different one. The pastor would only be once a month there. So sometimes they would go to the different churches, or sometimes you just have it, once a month. So it would kind of vary quite a bit. They kind of looked at the whole larger Manor congregation as one. So.
Question came up about the color of the doors and the shutters. I think Stacy was asking, based on the postcard, do we know what color those were at the time of the battle? Were they painted?
I don't know why I don't either know why they did purple. Obviously the pictures are black and white. But whether they were guessing from that, I know my co-author Terry, it was a big pet peeve of his. He doesn't like the kind of checkerboard pattern on the door either. That doesn't think that was right. But he had talked to folks that had attended, that their ancestors attended, and that there was another fella before named Reverend Austin Cooper that was writing a book in the 60s, and he had claimed he had talked to different folks that said they were green, and that's where Terry gets that it indeed was green.
Yep. Question here: are you working on any other topics or subjects for researching, or planning to write anything else in the future?
I'm not actually. I keep plenty busy. Like I said, I am actually. I'm happy to be upright. The Lyme disease took quite a toll on me, and for a while, I wasn't even able to walk or anything like that. I'm recovered somewhat, that I can function fairly well. But I've been blessed that I've become a pastor myself now, and I do lots of writing just in short bursts for sermons every Sunday. So. Between that and my wife and I run a pet rescue, which keeps us awfully busy, and they seem to fly by. So unfortunately, no, I've not been really done any more historical stuff since I left. And actually, talks like this keep me kind of connected, and I still stay in touch with my ranger friends and try to do my best. I was very excited about the burial map that was found
absolutely.
this week. So. But now I'm unfortunately drifting farther and farther away from the historical realm.
Yeah. A couple more here. Is there a list of the pastors of the church in the book? I believe there's some. I don't know.
Yeah, there's not a full list. The one thing that I have seen is there was a booklet that the Sharpsburg Church of the Brethren put out for their 100th anniversary, which I believe there's one in the library there at Antietam, that I do think lists the past. Now, I'm not sure how far it goes back, if it's just the ones from 1899 on or not. But I'm not sure on that, if the larger Church of the Brethren archive would have that or not. But unfortunately, no, I don't have that in my book.
Yeah. I got it. It was interesting. I received an email earlier this week from a gentleman named David Long. I don't believe he's on. He said he couldn't make it, but he's in the book as one of the elders, and he's directly related to him.
Okay, yeah, certainly. Yeah, David Long was the main elder at the time of the battle.
Yeah. The other question is the aerial view of the farm and the church. What year was that from? I think it was 1930, wasn't it? Somewhere.
I think it was 30 or 33, yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And then understand the man that sat on the right and the woman on the left who sat in the middle of the church. Oh, so explain again where the people sat in the church.
Okay, yeah, the men sat on the right hand side, and this would be looking towards the front. The men sat on the right, and the ladies sat on the left, and then the speakers or the elders would sit up on that front bench.
Yeah. Anybody else have any other questions? A lot of great comments, good presentation. Frank says your book is awesome. I've read it too. It's great. I have one question for you, and any of your research or digging there, we always wonder where Lee and Jackson and Longstreet were. Do we know if any of those guys were at the church at any time?
We would certainly think that Jackson was. I mean, his men were all through there. There's a couple of kinds of things supposedly in fields right behind the church that he did. They claim that he fell asleep on a big tree root behind the church somewhere. So there's not a particular account that places him in the church at any particular time. but certainly, you know, he was in command of the men right there, and there's several accounts that say in the vicinity of the church. So you have to think that Jackson certainly was, whether or not Lee, you know, came to meet with him up there, or if Jackson went into town. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about Longstreet. You know, he was a little farther down, but I would certainly think that Jackson would have been.
Right. Right. Okay. Let me go ahead and pull my screen up here. There we go. So we want to thank Alan. Great job. Just like Elizabeth, this is probably the third time I've heard his talk as well. Gets better every time. So certificate of appreciation there. We'll get this to you, and your first token of appreciation from us here at the end. We thank you very much. Hopefully we can have you back again. Great news for most of us. Those that are stuck on Zoom, we are going live next month. So July 1st, we are moving back to the inn outside. I'll be working on the tent and everything this week. So July 1st, our next speaker will be here. I'll tell you that in a minute. But because of the close proximity, even though we're outside, we're asking people to wear face masks, so forth. Try to set up under the tent, outside the tent, as you know, social distance as best as possible. Bring your own chair, because some of my chairs are going to our alternate site, which is going to be down at the square. If you remember where the old Victory Garden Ranch building was, 101 West Main Street, we have permission to use the inside of that. So in case of bad weather, we'll be moving down there. Next week's speaker will be Jim Rosebach. He'll be here, and his talk is called Goodbye Captain, and it's about the artillery at the Burnside Bridge in the final attack. So we don't hear too much of that. So he'll be talking about how the artillery from both sides, north and south, was a factor in that southern end of the battlefield. And my last announcement is because our first Zoom meeting was a snafu, mostly on my part, we're fortunate to have Gordy Dahman here with us here in Sharpsburg. So he's agreed to come out here on Sunday, July 5th, here at the inn at 5 o'clock to give his talk, The Wounding of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. So he'll be here at the inn. So if you're not doing anything that 4th of July weekend, come on out and hear Gordy's talk again. So let me up here.
Chris,
Yes.
Vance will be very, very pleased that that's happened July 5th, because he read the latest book on Oliver Wendell Holmes that came out. And then we missed the talk, but we didn't miss the talk. Now we can catch up with you on Oliver Wendell Holmes.
I'm sorry.
Oliver Wendell Holmes. There's a brand new book out, and Vance read it. Yeah. And now he's excited that he can hear the talk.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, my last thing I need to tell everybody is we won't be able to do the Zoom for these outdoor lectures. I don't think I have the capability to record them, so they'll be live. So unfortunately, you'll have to be here to watch them. So with that, we'd like to say goodbye and thank you again to Alan. And hopefully we'll see you all here next week and on July 5th. So thank you very much, Alan. Have a good evening, everybody.
This was fun.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
Is there a way to listen to the other presentations other than Facebook?
They are on YouTube. Well, I shouldn't say they. We only recorded the last week's speaker. That was it. So
That's great.
that's on a
the one-
YouTube.
Yeah, that's the
Um,
one I wanted to hear about, the U.S. sharpshooters. So do we just go on to YouTube and put Jacob in?
Yeah, go in and put Jacob Roebuck in, and that should come up as our latest
Great.
YouTube video. Yep.
Great. And thank you
then-
for doing all this.
Oh, yeah. And then
Yeah,
hopefully
great.
sometime tomorrow, Allen's will get put up there as well.
So you cannot record the next lectures?
I don't have